Hello, we are Keely Kriskovich, Ella Karadia, Elisa Alt, Hamna Mushtaq, and Lamprini Batska, and this is our presentation on Tiffany Valiante.
Today I'll be talking about the cold case of Tiffany Valiante, a 18-year-old volleyball player from New Jersey, supposedly killed by a train on July 12, 2015. However, authorities ruled her death as a suicide. Many believed she was murdered rather than committed suicide, as she never showed any signs of suicidal tendency, and her body was the only evidence found, except for the shoe found later on by the mother of Tiffany Valiante rather than the forensic investigator on the crime scene.
There is a plethora of regulations that crime scene investigators must follow, and many of them were violated during Valiante's investigation. The main violation was of ISO 17020, which specifies requirements for the competence of bodies performing inspection and for the impartiality and consistency of their inspection activities. This ISO was violated in these following ways. The evidence was never labeled with any initials of who handled the evidence, which results in a broken chain of custody. Improper packaging resulted in bacterial contamination of a piece of evidence. The scene was not properly secured, with there being multiple points of entry, random people entering the crime scene, etc. There was also a lack of proper PPE, which violates the PPE regulations of 2002. These are all the codes of conduct from the forensic science regulator that were violated by those attending the crime scene. The most blatant violations were of the following three codes: establish integrity and continuity of items as they come into your possession and ensure these are maintained while in your possession. Be prepared to review any casework if any new information or developments are identified that would impact the output of your work. And act with honesty, integrity, objectivity, and impartiality. I'm going to focus on the last violation of the code mentioned, as it is also related to the basic tenet of treat the location as a crime scene until assessed and determined to be otherwise, which is especially important in a death scene investigation. This was not followed, as since the first attending officers automatically assumed it was a suicide, this led to laziness in all aspects of the investigation of her death. In terms of how this scene should have been handled, the first officer attending should have separated the crime scene into multiple areas, not just where the body was found. This would include the road next to the train tracks, which could have been searched for tire tracks, footmarks, blood drops, or any other sort of trace evidence. They should have also sectioned off any of the routes to get to the section of the train tracks where her body was found, along with her house, even if just to collect control samples. If these steps were followed, her shoes, along with the couple other pieces of evidence, would have been discovered by the officers at the scene rather than her mother days later. Or, if not, as in if those pieces of evidence were disposed of at that location later on, then that would raise suspicion that a third party must be involved in some way. This all could have also possibly led to completely new discoveries. For example, if there were distinct new tire tracks, this would also indicate a third party who could have driven her party up to the train tracks and then placed her body there.
DNA evidence found at the scene. Tiffany's black t-shirt that she was seen wearing the night she was killed was found at the crime scene. It was found with bloodstains on the front exterior part of the shirt. A presumptive test was done on the t-shirt on the liquid found on it. This concluded that it was blood. However, a confirmatory test was not performed. This means that the blood on the shirt could have been Tiffany's, but it also could have been someone else's. The t-shirt was placed in a plastic evidence bag, causing it to mold. The t-shirt was also packaged when it was still damp. No testing could have been done after the initial investigation due to the condition of the evidence and how it was moldy and unusable. What did the examiners do wrong? The examiners did not change their gloves after collecting a piece of evidence, causing contamination. Improperly packaged the evidence, causing it to no longer be useful. The correct testing did not occur, and also the evidence was improperly stored. All of these things could have provided, done correctly, a more conclusive answer in the case. What could and should have been done in this investigation using protocol and PPE? The gloves should have been changed after collecting each piece of evidence, as by not doing this, it will have caused contamination. Contamination will occur as fragments from other parts of the crime scene could be left on the gloves, and then if not changed, can be transferred to another piece of evidence or another area of the crime scene. Gloves could also be broken or get a hole in them from the process of analyzing the crime scene, which could cause the investigator's DNA to be left at the crime scene and on evidence as well. Other barrier clothing, if being used, should also be changed, like the gloves, if they are to get anything on them or appear to be stained. The t-shirt was improperly packaged. Packaging should at a minimum include the items being separated, the use of an appropriate sized package, secure sealing, and appropriate labeling. As the t-shirt was wet, it should have been dried in a controlled environment. The samples that were stained with blood should be dried away from other evidence to reduce contamination. Clothing also needs to be packaged in a paper bag after drying and stored in the dry storage. The dry storage should include a dry cabinet with temperature control, humidity control, under negative air pressure, and an air recirculated through an activated high-efficiency particulate air filter. The drying area should not be in direct sunlight. The walls, ceiling, and floor should have surfaces that readily allow decontamination, and the dry storage should also contain a locking mechanism to prevent access except by the authorized personnel. The correct testing should have been performed, meaning a confirmatory test should have been performed on the blood found on the t-shirt to ensure that it was in fact Tiffany Valentine's and not that of a possible criminal.
The blood card that was obtained from Tiffany Valiante had the identity assumed by her uncle upon visual recognition, and according to the law firm that represented the Valiantes in the case, no scientific test was carried out on the body to identify her. The victim's limbs were severed and some of the remains, specifically the spine and femurs, were measured to provide her height, which was her only noticeable feature. The only DNA that was recovered from the victim was blood on the bracelet that she was wearing, and it was recovered from that rather than from the tissue of her remains. Later on, they then carried out a paternity test, which allowed for the analysis of STR sequences to be compared to her parental DNA. The blood card was then treated in a very unprofessional manner. The evidence that was collected was sealed correctly. However, many of them didn't have initials on the tape or were illegible. Not only this, but they weren't dated either. This is very important due to the improper performance of the chain of custody when handling evidence. There was male DNA detected in combination with Tiffany's. Due to the lack of care when handling the evidence, a comparison wasn't made and the evidence was dismissed. Not only was the DNA most likely to be contaminated, but was also left outside at the crime scene for a long period of time, which would have resulted in the necrosis of the soft tissue of the body. As well as this, there were 2 rainstorms between the time of death and the time the evidence was collected, which allowed time for the DNA to decay and degrade, and therefore making it complicated for further analysis and comparison. Another failure in the chain of custody was evidence that was lost. The New Jersey transit team lost an axe that was found at the crime scene, and was reported to have had red marks on. However, it was unsure whether a presumptive test was carried out before the axe was lost. The chain of custody of a piece of evidence is imperative. whatever evidence has been recovered. This is to ensure that the continuity and the integrity of the item is maintained so the evidence can be analysed to a full extent and so that the evidence doesn't get dismissed in court. This is done by ensuring that the packaging is a standard that follows the standard operating procedure. This allows the integrity of the item to be maintained and is done through using correct packaging and ensuring that the item is fully sealed within the packaging. If it is compromised, the court could presume that it is contaminated or that the evidence has been tampered with. The chain of custody shows every person who has handled or possessed the item and is kept to a minimum number of people as possible to ensure that the probability of the item being contaminated is as little as possible.
While processing a crime scene, there are 7 main processes that the police and the investigators should have followed. Those main processes are secure the scene, separate the witnesses, scan the scene, see the scene, sketch the scene, search for evidence, secure and collect evidence. For this case, the police did not secure the scene quite well, as they drove through the crime scene and the section they should have sectioned off. For separating the witnesses, they didn't even separate the witnesses as they talked to the student engineer 10 days after the incident and didn't even interview the family. 2-3 weeks after the incident, and the family took this to call and also called the police multiple times to tell them, hey, can you interview us? Scan the scene. The scene was not scanned properly as there was quite a lot of evidence that weren't collected. See the scene. Excluding the uncle, the rest of the family haven't really seen the scene. When the investigators went through a path that they believe Tiffany went through, but they did not really much look at more probabilities, and the map that I'm showing you, number 20, is showing the path the police actually believe that Tiffany went through. Sketch the scene. There is no evidence that the scene was sketched. For example, Exhibit 21, that's a piece of work her uncle did to show kind of where the evidence was found and everything. Search for evidence. The investigators did search for the crime scene for Tiffany's remains and some evidence that were near them. Secure and collect evidence. The evidence was contaminated or lost, and the evidence were not secured properly as they can be sent to the lab. And by that, of course, the police did not wear the proper PPE uniform. And I also forgot to say, in the secure the scene, also by the police going through the section they should have secured, there might be contaminating evidence like footprint might be there. What the police and the investigators should have done correctly while collecting the evidence that should be collected from the crime scene to be sent to the laboratory should have been, when securing the scene, the police should have secured the scene at least more than the actual crime scene, so they at least could have gotten more evidence, and so they did not lose any other evidence, like, as I said before, footprints. Separate the witnesses. They should have actually interviewed the student engineer straight away that happened before he even changed his story or something changed, so they can literally have that down, exactly what happened at that moment. And they should have at least got the family to actually ask them, hey, was your daughter was wearing? Was this the clothes? When did you see her last? But they did not even do that. Scan the scene. They should have scanned the scene from the path the victim took, but the police and investigators took to one path that they believe the victim took. If they have looked at the more probabilities that the victim that Tiffany must have taken more pathways, they might have found new evidence that would have helped them maybe solve this case. See the scene. They should have seen the scene, but the thing is that they did not actually even call the family to come and see the scene, so at least the family know what's going on, but they called the uncle for her. Sketch the scene. The police should have sketched the scene from where the victim body was found and from where the victim was last seen. But there's not really much evidence that they have done that, so they might have not. Search for evidence. The investigators should have searched more for any other evidence that may have led to solving this crime. So maybe because they did not secure the scene quite good enough, maybe some of her remains will have been more further away and they did not see that. Secure and collect the evidence. For this one, the investigators and the forensics should have wore the proper PPE uniform. They should have collected the evidence quite carefully and should have separated them to different bags, specifically the evidence that should have been collected and put to a paper bag and not a plastic bag, as they did. And they should have sealed the evidence properly so the evidence did not get contaminated, and they should have kept a better record of the evidence that they already had.
Mishandling evidence of Tiffany Valiante's case. The case never reached the court as within 24 hours of Tiffany's death, the authorities and the authorization was they registered her death as a suicide. Her body was not subjected to an autopsy. They did carry out an autopsy, but it was not very detail oriented as they already registered the case as a suicide. Both DNA and a rape case test was never conducted. Moreover, toxicology revealed she had no alcohol or narcotics in her system, which is very rare and unusual for a suicide case. She was never the subject of a psychiatric autopsy to determine whether she was suicidal, as the authorization never wanted to neglect her case and take her case as a suicide. DNA sample mishandling in the case of Tiffany. The laboratory director of forensics in New Jersey, Julie A. Heining, PhD, did say this quote: "We have extensive experience over decades performing analysis on evidence with degraded DNA, but in this instance we were only able to obtain very little DNA for comparison due to the manner in which moisture resulted in bacterial contamination," meaning that the forensic investigators never packaged her evidence properly and contaminated the DNA sample of Tiffany Valiante. On top of that, due to the endless chains of custody and contamination of the evidence sample, a DNA blood card containing a sample of Tiffany Valiante's blood was only verified after paternity testing. They never did a DNA sample test on the day they found her body or when they registered her case as suicide, because they neglected their duties and named it as a suicide and contaminated the evidence around it of the crime scene. What could have the lab technicians done right with the evidence in Tiffany's case? The lab technicians should have conducted a rape kit test to see if Tiffany was sexually assaulted. Moreover, they should have conducted a detailed autopsy to see if she had any internal trauma inflicted on her from somewhere else rather than the train tragedy she suffered from. However, they did none of that and registered her case as a suicide within 24 hours, neglecting any evidence around the crime scene and missing evidence such as the axe they lost from the crime scene and the shoe the mother found of Tiffany later on rather than the investigators. The references that we have used and resources are on slides 16, 17 and 18. Thank you for listening to us.